I just wanted to go over some updates with my company, how things have been going, how I see the market kind of moving right now, and just my overall thoughts on like what's going on. So the first thing I want to go over was a couple of weeks ago, there was an article that came out that was saying that China was only about 3 months behind the US when it comes to AI development, which is pretty insane, right? And when you see these new models dropping out of China, like Manus, like R1, DeepSeek R1, Owl, just goes on and on and on. Model came out of Baidu, Alibaba, just goes on. It's really interesting, and it's really most of the time on either side, either the US side or the Chinese side, they'll talk about, how, the Chinese model just destroys everything and makes everything on the US side obsolete. And then, of course, the US side will say, oh, it doesn't matter. China's still behind, OpenAI still has the best models XYZ, and that China's never going to be able to close the gap. So both sides are pretty much incentivized to overinflate the performance of their models and just kind of push out numbers that don't really make sense. And even if the benchmarks for these models, which basically test how efficient, um, how many questions did a large language model answer accurately, so on and so forth. A lot of these benchmarks just aren't really designed to really test and push the limits of the large language models. They're really just there to be used as a marketing tool to say, hey, this new model came out with, 50% accuracy on their benchmark. And in reality, it doesn't really matter. It's not really giving you much performance boost overall. So again, when you're seeing these new models coming out from these companies, I would really just focus on the actual concrete new developments, not just some, random benchmark that's not really relevant for people. Because actually, when Llama 4 released, like I believe a couple of days ago out of Meta, and they were saying, hey, these benchmarks, oh my God, the benchmarks, the benchmarks, so amazing, right? And then a whole bunch of people are actually complaining on Twitter, talking about like, hey, I've been using the model itself, and it's not really giving me the value that I thought it was going to give, right? So because I saw the benchmarks, I saw the performance, and I thought, hey, this is going to be a next major step forward. But in reality, it's actually doing somewhat worse than other models in tasks like coding, reasoning, so on and so forth. What's more important than the actual model itself is the data that you're using, right? So how you're handling the data, how you're cleaning the data, how you're preparing the entire pipeline, how you're preparing the evaluation pipeline to actually evaluate the performance of the AI model. Like these things are way more important than choosing the actual model itself, because at this point, every single day there's a new model coming out. I think there was a large language model that came out from LG, the same LG that makes TVs and phones and everything else. So literally every single day there's a new model coming out. Don't worry about it. If, a model came out like a couple days ago and everybody's, singing its praises, saying it's the best thing ever, literally in the next couple days, it's going to be obsolete, right? It doesn't really matter. Again, it's just get a model from a company that's reputable, that's, it's going to have, they have good practices when it comes to their data, and you should be fine. Now, an interesting thought that I was kind of having in my head over the past couple days is kind of seeing AI as more of a hidden layer than the actual feature itself, right? Because like at this point, everybody knows that AI is important. Everybody knows that, hey, if you're not using AI, then in your business, then you're going to fall behind. But the important thing to understand with AI is that it's going to be a lot like quantum computing in the sense that it's going to become a part of the calculation layer and not the actual feature. Meaning that instead of going to, like, let's say a potential customer and saying, hey, I work on AI, I build models or I fine tune them or I do this or I do that, that's basically going to become the expectation, saying like, hey, well, yeah, obviously you need to be able to do these things. And it's basically going to come down to what data do you have access to, right? So for example, let's talk about mining, right? So extraction of minerals or rare earth minerals, making that process more efficient, more, um, getting the higher yield. Basically, what kind of data do you have access to that you can feed into an AI model and essentially build a feedback loop so that you can, either train people on the process or you can refine the process yourself or do whatever. The point is that the main selling point is not going to be AI itself. It's going to be how can I use AI to essentially speed up the process of data processing or testing or whatever, basically figuring out how can I, increase the yield from extraction of like a mineral or pretty much anything that you can think of, right? So that's what I think AI is already right now. That's what it is. Again, because the models themselves are just, there's just so many of them coming out every single day from another company that at this point, the actual model doesn't matter. It's really about the data and how you handle that data. And it's really more about traditional tasks like being a data scientist or a data engineer, sitting down, looking over, um, is the data organized in a coherent and reasonable fashion that a large language model can understand? Or maybe in the future, when maybe transformer-based models, large language models are kind of falling out of style, and maybe something else takes the reins, like a diffusion-based model or something else. We're going to have to basically sit down and rethink our way of how we essentially the relationship between the data itself and the AI model itself. Also, I wanted to go over a one major benefit of AI for software engineers, and that's basically making the issue of vendor lock-in like way less relevant. So basically what vendor lock-in is when you are using a cloud-based service like AWS or Google, and they have their own way of interfacing with code. They have their own standards, they have their own practices, and basically over time, when you optimize a program or an application on their platform to run within their cloud service, then it would basically be a lot harder to migrate to another service because again your entire code base is optimized for Amazon or for Google, and therefore you would just basically say, you know what, it's going to take way too much time, way too much energy to port all this code over, so we might as well just stay here and just keep on using them. And even though they're maybe like raising the prices, or maybe there isn't enough resources for everybody to go around, whatever, right? That's the general idea of like what vendor lock-in um, was. And it was actually a pretty major problem just a couple of years ago, just like 5, 10 years ago. The idea that, you can just seamlessly, you know, build out an application on Amazon and then go switch over to another cloud service provider, or just host the model, or excuse me, host the application yourself on your own servers. That would be a major pain in the ass because again, you had to rewrite a massive amount of code, you have to re-optimize a bunch of things, and it would just be a massive headache in general. However, with AI, it's made pretty much that entire process not necessarily seamless, but a whole lot easier than it was in the past, right? So with AI, basically the way that it works is you'd sit down, you type in, hey, I want to port over my code out of Amazon, and I want to basically rebuild certain sections of the code base to be used within my own server. Let's go through that process of how to do that. And someone who's maybe less experienced, like a junior developer, for example, can go through that process and they can just focus on the high level task. Like, hey, we want to keep this part of the code base. Don't touch that. Okay, hey, actually, this isn't all that important. We can modify that. We can just, throw that away. It doesn't matter. And basically, using some type of framework, using some type of checklist that's been put out there by a senior dev, or the lead, or whatever the case may be, then they can actually leverage these AI tools and be way more effective at their job because they're not getting lost or not wasting a bunch of time on tasks that don't really matter, that don't really push the needle forward. Junior devs coming into the market now, they can leverage AI as a learning tool, as a learning resource, sit down, shorten the curve for learning as much as possible. So instead of learning concepts like maybe in 3 to 6 months, they can cut that down to maybe a month and a half, maybe even less.